And like I said, we're heading over to England. Now, first, we started, where did we start? We're seeing democracy in England. Where did we see it first? Put it in the chat for a point. Where did we first look at democracy? Oh, we looked at Rome for something else. Where do we first look at democracy? Ah, yes, Philip and Nadal, good job. Greece, right? But not all of Greece was democratic. What particular city-state? Ah, Dylan, on the money. Yes, Athens, good job. So we looked at democracy there. Why did we study the Romans? What were we looking at in Rome? What important thing that governs our lives? The development of something. Think of what Justinian did. Not religion. We did talk about religion the end of last week. Yes, Miguel, the laws. Okay, the rule of law. So that story of democracy and the rule of law takes us now to England and takes us way ahead of the ancient time period. Speaking of which, this week is the last chance to do that ancient world map for those easy points. Okay, it's going to be gone after this week, so make sure you get to that. Okay. So we're going to start back in medieval England about 1,000 years ago. And if you look, those of you who've done the ancient map, you know that England is just off the coast of Europe proper. But look how close it is. Okay, the English Channel right here. Look how close it is to France. Okay, it's just a little over 20 miles. People swim it now. As an accomplishment, you know, like people do marathons and things like that. So people swim the channel. And so you would think it would be easy to just get a bunch of boys on boats and head across the channel and conquer England. Well, only one person in history has ever done it. And that guy is William of Normandy. Okay? Normandy is this area covered up by the little, does that toolbar show up when I'm presenting? Or is it just on my screen? Okay.
I don't see, I see your...
See the dot?
I see the dot.
All right. So this area down here that's shaded in, that's part of France called Normandy. And a few centuries before William, it was conquered by Vikings. So Normans are French Vikings, and they're pretty badass. And William was their leader. And he went across the English Channel, and he did something that no one else will be able to do. A lot of people will try. The King of Spain, Philip II, will try. Napoleon, you may have heard of him, he'll try. Hitler, probably heard of him. They all try to conquer England and they all fail. William's the only one that ever does it. And he changes what England is quite a bit. He ends that old feudal system, which we didn't really talk much about in this class, but it's the way things were organized after the fall of the Roman Empire with very local laws and local rulers. We didn't have nations. What William starts to do is centralize the government and create what will be the nation of England and ultimately the nation of Great Britain. And so it's his centralizing influence that starts it all. Okay? And again, we're talking over many, many years and even centuries that this is going to develop. So William was a king. We had a monarchy. And as you know, the problem or the benefit of monarchy is that basically the next king is the son, or if they allow queens, the daughter of the current king. And they're not always really cut out for the job. In William's case, his son was cut out to be king and was an excellent king, and his name was Henry II. And Henry II gave us a lot of reform on the legal system. Back in medieval times, if two people had a dispute, they would have to fight it out, and whoever won the fight won the dispute. Henry replaces that with a jury trial, right? Where, like we would have today, you would go in, you would present evidence, and you'd have a royal judge, and he would try to hear the testimony of 12 men, and then the judge will make a decision. It's not based on who wins the fight, but on the facts of the case. And that's where we get the 12 people on a jury today in jury trials. So that's a very modern approach to settling legal disputes that Henry brings about. And he also continues what Justinian had done. You remember the Codex Justinianus and then another thing called the Digest? That's a piling up, a compilation of all the decisions of all the judges that have been recorded. And then when you have a new case as a judge, you look at what judges have done in the past to help you make your decision what you're going to do. That's called common law. And it builds up as time goes by. So pretty soon, well, not pretty soon, but after a while, you have what's called legal precedent, or examples of in the past they did this, so that's what I'm going to do. And so common law becomes the basis of English law and the basis of our law in the United States. Now we're going to fast forward a couple hundred years to a not as good king and to a very famous piece of paper right here. And it's called the Great Charter, or in Latin, Magna Carta. Magna Carta. And England had a not popular and not, he was neither, if you're not going to be popular and liked, you want people to be scared of you, right? You want to try and get either one of those. Well, they weren't afraid of him and they didn't like him. And that was King John. Have any of you seen the Disney Robin Hood, the animated one with all the animals? Anybody? Yeah. Raised here in North America? Seen this?
Isn't it the Little Red Riding Hood?
Well, it's Robin Hood, and Robin Hood's a fox, and the sheriff is a big bear, but King John is like a lion, but his crown's too big, keeps falling down over his face, and he sucks his thumb. And okay, I'm going to stop talking about this because it's really not getting us anywhere.
Well, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question?
Quickly, though, and then turn your mic off.
Is his name Robin Hood because he's from the hood? Is his name Robin?
No, it's his name's Robin of Locksley, but he wore a hood to hide his identity.
Oh.
Yeah, hoods hadn't been invented yet. So King John is unpopular, and he gets into trouble with the church and with the nobles. He's fighting an unsuccessful war in France, and he wants money, so he tries to raise taxes on the nobles, and they force him to sign this document that recognizes certain rights. And this is important because it's the first time a king ever acknowledged that he had to obey the law as well. All right, so in this Magna Carta, John promises to obey the law. He promises that he won't raise taxes unless the people approve of having their taxes raised. Something that's very important to us to this day. And then he also promises something that we're going to look at more today called due process. And that's what you can expect when you get arrested. All right? When you get arrested, you expect that you will be charged with a crime. You'll have a chance to give your side of the story, et cetera, et cetera. You cannot just arrest people because you don't like them. And that's what the king had been doing, and kings in the rest of Europe will continue to do. If they don't like you, they can just, in France, they have what's called carte blanche, or the white card, and the king can just issue an arrest warrant, and you get locked up because the king said so. Well, the Magna Carta says the king can't do that. If you're going to be arrested, you have to be charged with a crime, and you have to get a jury trial and things like that. So that's where we get that from. Getting away from the law and back to taxes, if the king needs people's permission to raise their taxes, how do they give their permission? Well, the important people, the powerful people, come together and meet, and they vote yes or no on taxes, yes or no on going to war, things like that. And that eventually, that meeting comes to be called Parliament. And Parliament to this day is England's legislature. Okay, it's like our Congress. It's their lawmaking body. And so that's really where it starts, with these meetings getting together to decide whether or not we're going to give the king more tax money to support wars and things like that. So that's Parliament. And it's going to be perfected more under Henry's grandson, Edward I. And Edward I is a very famous and infamous king. He's ruthless, kills his own son, does a lot of stuff that makes him a good character in Shakespeare plays and in movies like Braveheart. But he calls Parliament together, and he takes a new approach at it. Not only does he call the rich and powerful nobles and the knights, but he also calls what it says there the burgesses. Okay, so who are the burgesses? In Germany, they're called burghers. In France, they're called les bourgeoisie. We call them the middle class. Okay, he includes the townspeople in the parliament. So this is not nobles or knights, and they're not peasants or serfs. They're lawyers and teachers and goldsmiths and shoemakers, and basically merchants from the towns get to have representation. And so that's really what makes what we now call the model parliament. And ultimately it splits into two bodies, because the super high up nobility doesn't really want to rub elbows with the townspeople. So we get the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And those two bodies together pass legislation and approve taxes and things like that. And that's still how it's set up today in Britain. That's why it's called the model parliament. And so everything goes perfect from then on. No, it doesn't. Kings are going to keep testing the limits. They're going to keep testing how much power does Parliament want to have? How much can they rule things in the way that they want to? And let me get the lights turned back on. So, that's not that.
That's
It's
not the
no.
governor.
All right. So there's going to be a struggle over a few hundred years. Who really is in charge? All those people in Parliament or the king? It's going to really come to a head with this new family that takes the throne of England called the Stuarts. And that's James the first of the Stuarts. And before James, Elizabeth had been the queen. And you may have heard of her, Elizabeth I. She was one of the most famous monarchs in English history, and she worked pretty well with Parliament. She was able to compromise with a lot of people, and that's why she ruled for a long time. And she also never took a husband, because that would sort of split her power. So she was called the Virgin Queen, not really, but she was called the Virgin Queen because she didn't have any children. And so when she died, the throne left her family, who were called the Tudors, like Henry VIII. You may have heard of him. He was her dad. And the Tudor line ends, and the Stuarts come to the throne with James I. And he is the King of Scotland. And he's already a king of a place when he takes over being King of England. And he believes in something called divine right. In fact, he wrote a book on it called The True Law of Free Monarchies. And he says that king's power comes directly from God, not from Parliament, not from the people, okay? That God makes kings. And so who would James I answer to? Just God. Okay, so he said, I don't answer to Parliament. I can do what I want, and I'll be judged when I die. The Parliament doesn't like that. There are some other issues that aren't part of our main story, but are still important. Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, he had taken England out of the Catholic Church as a whole, took the whole country out. And he started a church of his own called the Church of England, which looked very much like the Catholic Church. And there were a lot of people in England who wanted to fully leave the Catholic Church and practice more what we call true Protestantism. And those people were called Puritans. And they didn't like the rules put on them in England. They didn't want to be part of the Church of England. And so eventually James says, okay, you can leave. And he creates a territory for them in the New World, in New England. And those that want to live under their own religious rules can go to New England, and they sail over there and they arrive. And we celebrate that now in November. And so what do we call those people? They're called Puritans. When they came here and they landed and celebrated on the Thanksgiving, those people were called what? They have big belt buckles on their hats. You learned it in middle school. No? No? Well, no big fans of Thanksgiving. Good, Julian. Thank you. Yeah, pilgrims. Okay, so those first pilgrims come to the United States, or what will be the United States, because they don't want to live under James's Anglican rule. He also gives them their own Bible. For Protestants, it's very important that they be able to read the Bible. And so he creates a new translation in English of the Bible that's called the King James Version. If you are a Protestant, it's likely that your Bible to this day is a King James Version. So that stuff's not part of our main story, but worth mentioning. James uses something that was pioneered by one of the early Henrys, Henry III, and it's called the Star Chamber. And here's James's main problem. He doesn't want to share power with Parliament, but only Parliament has the right to give him money. So James is going to try all different kinds of ways to raise money so he doesn't have to ask Parliament. One of the ways he does it is he invites the nobles into the Star Chamber, which sounds pretty cool, right? Like a planetarium or a laser show. It's actually a room where they strap you down and there are stars painted on the ceiling, and that's what you look at while they torture you until you agree to give the king money. So that's not very popular among the nobles. And he ignores the legal tradition that had been established before him and becomes very unpopular. But Parliament has a problem. Only the king can call Parliament into session. So as long as James doesn't need extra money, as long as he can get by on the cheap, he doesn't need to call Parliament. And he rules for 25 years without calling Parliament into session. So they can be as mad as they want. They can't do anything about it. So he's able to raise money all different kinds of ways and rule without Parliament until he dies. Okay? And then he does die, and his son becomes king. And there's his son, kind of a harmless-looking fellow. Right? And that's Charles I. Charles I cannot stay out of trouble like his dad did. And so he gets into wars, and he has, even worse, he has two rebellions inside England. The Irish rebel and the Scots rebel, right? These are two populations that the English controlled that didn't like that. And to put down these rebellions, he needs what? Money. And so he calls Parliament into session and says, hey, grant me some tax money. And Parliament says, no, your father and you have ruled against the way you're supposed to rule according to the Magna Carta and tradition. So we're not going to give you any money until you promise to straighten up and rule according to the rules. And so Charles signs the Petition of Right, which is a promise to recognize all these things, which we saw in the Magna Carta. No taxing without Parliament's permission, no imprisoning citizens illegally, or due process must be observed. No housing of troops in homes. This was a big thing. This was very unpopular for reasons I'm sure you can imagine. And that's why it ended up in our Constitution. You cannot, the army cannot force you to keep soldiers in your house, right? So he agrees in theory to do all of this stuff, in addition to not having his own military when there's not a war. And he promises that he'll do that, and Parliament gives him the money. He immediately then starts breaking those promises. And he figures he can break all the promises as long as he doesn't need Parliament again. But then another rebellion breaks out, and he needs Parliament and again, and he calls them into session. They say, we're not giving you anything. And so this time he decides to play hardball. He says, well, I'm the king. And so he goes to arrest the leaders of Parliament. The leaders of Parliament find out, and so they're not there. And Parliament raises its own army to fight against the king's army, and we get the English Civil War. And we get two sides. Anti-royalist, or the parliamentary forces, and they're led by Oliver Cromwell, and they're called the Roundheads. And then the king's forces, or the Cavaliers, and there's going to be a civil war, and they're going to, initially the king makes some gains, but gradually these parliamentary forces are going to win. Charles I will be captured and arrested, tried as a traitor, and have his head cut off. And this is the first time in the West that we see a representative body bringing a king up on charges of treason and chopping his head off. And this makes the rest of Europe very nervous. And so now temporarily, this guy's going to be in charge. As you can tell from his picture, he is a lot of fun. And that's Oliver Cromwell. And he's going to set up a temporary dictatorship, which isn't going to be popular. So they're going to bring back the monarchy in what's called the Restoration. Right? So Cromwell tries to do a commonwealth. He tries to rule with Parliament. Remember, he had been on Parliament's side, but eventually Parliament starts to disagree with him, mainly about keeping his army after the war. And so he uses his army to get rid of Parliament, and he rules as a dictator. And that's when it's called the Protectorate. Okay, and he's a very devout Protestant. And so he makes most fun things illegal. The whole country is like the town in Footloose. There's no dancing, no drinking, no gambling, no sports, none of that. It's kind of like living under lockdown. But he's very unpopular, needless to say. And so when he dies, the people are ready for a change, and Parliament offers the crown to Charles II, son of Charles I. And they say, hey, sorry about your dad, you know, things happen. How about you put it behind you and you agree to be the king? And Charles II takes the throne from Parliament, brings back the monarchy. He is a popular, charismatic guy. He brings back all the fun things, the dancing, the drinking, the sports, etc. And so initially he's very popular, but it's not going to last. Okay. Parliament, now having arranged to have the king come back, thinks it definitely has the upper hand. Charles wants to raise money on his own. And so what he's going to do is he's going to make a deal with the king he'd been staying with, Louis XIV, who we'll talk about in the next unit, the King of France. And he's secretly taking money from the King of France. Now, this is not good. The King of England is taking money from the King of France. And even worse, he'd promised the King of France that he would make England Catholic again. These religious issues really play into this at this time. We don't need to go into that much, but Louis XIV wanted all of Europe to be Catholic again. And Charles says, okay, I'll promise to work on that if you pay me £250,000 a year, which back then was a lot of money. And so it comes out that the King of England has been secretly conspiring with the King of France to make England Catholic again. And this is all about to come to a head, but then Charles has the good sense to die. And his brother James II takes over. And we're going to get what's called the Glorious Revolution. All right. So James II, the brother of Charles, he doesn't even pretend, he doesn't even keep it a secret that he's Catholic. He's allied with Louis of France, and his wife is Catholic, and she has a Catholic baby boy. And now Parliament and much of England is terrified that they'll be ruled by Catholic kings forever. And so they thought, hey, we offered the crown to his brother. If we can offer it, we can take it away. And so they take the crown and they offer it to his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William. And William is the Prince of Orange, which is the color of the ruling house of the Netherlands. So he's already got his own army. And they offer the throne to William and Mary. And William shows up to accept the throne with his army. James doesn't have his own army, so there's not going to be a fight. In fact, James runs away and moves in with Louis XIV at his palace that we're going to look at in the next unit. And William and Mary accept the crown from Parliament, and that's called the Glorious Revolution because there was no blood. James left, they took over, and that's why it's called the Glorious Revolution, because there wasn't another civil war. And they're going to create what we call, and there are still, this is England still to this day, a constitutional monarchy. In other words, they have kings and queens, but the kings and queens have to obey the law just like everybody else. They're not above the law. And so that's what makes it a constitutional monarchy. There's a list of rules that everybody has to obey. Right? And in fact, to make everything really clear, the next year, 1689, Parliament presents the English Bill of Rights to William and Mary, and they sign it into law. All right? And basically, it's a formal list of all that stuff we've been talking about since the Magna Carta. All right? And they accept the Bill of Rights from Parliament, and it says these things we've been talking about. The laws are the laws. The king can't suspend them. The king cannot have his own private army. Due process, okay, no excessive bail, no cruel and unusual punishment, all right? And then the main one, they promise to call Parliament regularly and not try to rule without Parliament for years and years and years like James did and Charles tried. So they have something called the Triennial Act, which means that Parliament has to be called at least every 3 years. Because once Parliament's in session, they truly are in charge. They can make laws that even the king has to obey. over the years that changes, and now Parliament has to be in session every single year. And Parliament really is the power that runs England and the rest of the United Kingdom. So as we always do, let's end with what's the legacy? What's left behind? Why are we still studying it? Well, the Glorious Revolution and then this official listing of rights sets an example for the American colonists who consider themselves Englishmen. The Glorious Revolution is about the rights not of women, not of other people, but of Englishmen. And the colonists consider themselves Englishmen, and they will feel their rights aren't being respected, and that's why they will rebel and will have the American Revolution, which we'll talk about in the next unit as well. All right, so that's the end. That's a lot, but that's the end of our first unit in terms of new material. Okay, so now follow me back over to the class site for some stuff that's very important. All right, so we're changing the way we do the guided reading, right? We did the first two in Google Forms and it was a little wonky. This is smoother. If you used PowerSchool last year when you were a freshman, that's what this is. So you already have an account. So watch what I do. So here's Valley Center Palm, and there you see the login for PowerSchool. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go over to this page. Just click login with Google, and then you will see this screen. And this screen is where you're going to do the review questions. And it's a little more straightforward